Good evening and welcome to this week's edition of Behind the Headlines. And in this programme, we shall be marking the 5th anniversary since a mysterious virus from China swept across the world and infected the entire world, including our country, with this pandemic known as COVID-19 that not only changed our lives, but changed the world forever. And we saw that in this nation alone, over 200,000 people lost their lives because of COVID-19. And 5 years on from the global pandemic, COVID-19, we'll be asking what was the truth behind this pandemic. Reagan, it's great to see you again for Behind the Headlines. And I can't believe that it's now 5 years since Boris Johnson made that television address to the nation, calling upon restrictions because of this global pandemic that brought fear and mayhem in his wake, known as COVID-19.
Well, it really has gone by very quickly, and what a jarring moment in time that was. For multiple weeks before, we were being told, no, this is nothing to worry about. This is not anything that we're going to be doing in the context of locking things down like had been done in Wuhan in China and was already being mooted in Italy. We were being told that we had a pandemic plan in place and that we would be sticking with that pandemic plan and that it would be the most effective to attain herd immunity is the technical scientific term for it, that would be the best for everyone, physically, mentally, emotionally, and economically for the nation as well. All of that was thrown into the bin, and we then proceeded down this period as there were concerning amounts of admissions to hospital. People were dying. There were some very distressing stories and symptoms that people were experiencing. In other cases, people were not experiencing any major symptoms, maybe losing their taste and their smell for a little part of time. But this escalated and became a massive ordeal that lasted a couple of years and has arguably continued to massively impact us in our lives to this day.
No, absolutely. So let's remind ourselves of some of the key figures and facts. So the global pandemic became known as COVID-19, took the lives of 227,000 people living in the UK and over 7 million worldwide since January of 2020. The first COVID TV announcement was made on the 16th of March 2020. Our Prime Minister at the time, Boris Johnson, announced that now was the time for everyone to stop non-essential contact and travel. A week later, this was followed by the first lockdown as millions were confined to their homes. The government measures to prevent the virus from spreading also resulted in the suspension of civil liberties and cost the government billions. Churches were closed and forced to go online, and those who did open their doors faced the full wrath of the law. We found ourselves living in a dystopian nightmare where our nation and the world were gripped with fear, and our mainstream media were whipping everyone up into a frenzy and into a panic. Amongst Christians and non-believers, there was an accelerated interest in Bible prophecy as people tried to make sense of the apocalyptic times that we're living in. And now serious questions are being raised about the origins of COVID-19 pandemic 5 years on, with the fingers firmly pointing at the Wuhan Institute of Virology in China, which is a lab being leaked responsible for the global pandemic. And we have to ask the very big question, have the lessons of COVID-19 been learned? But we also want to honour the memories of those who perished during the COVID-19 pandemic.
It's critical, Simon, that we ask questions, that we can ask questions at the same time as honoring those who passed away. There were multiple people I knew who passed away during that season, and I reflect on their names periodically. I think of John Theodore, who was my late father-in-law's best friend and a ministry partner, who went on a ventilator and passed away, never came back from that. I think of a colleague with a social issues team I've worked with for a decade, Norman Hopkins of Family Education Trust. He passed away very early on, was taken off in an ambulance, and there was no one in his family able to be there with him when he died. I think of so many others who suffered greatly, even with the long COVID, which left a lot of impact on their respiratory system, as well as in some cases scarring on the heart, also due to other impact. And we look at, you quoted 220,000 people that died. You know, people can bandy about the statistics and can talk about, is that died of or died with, but ultimately, you know, there's no use denying that this was a major world event. There's some who would like to say, oh no, it was just like a normal flu. Okay, there are elements of that are a reality, yes, but the impact that it had, both in response, the systemic stripping away of freedoms, allegedly to protect and save lives, all of that narrative has to be questioned, and is being increasingly questioned, even when we look at some of the treatments and preventative measures taken. Increasingly, scientific studies, increasingly people who were fully on side with the narrative are saying, we got this one wrong.
No, absolutely. And of course, we need to mention Alan Tung, as part of our Bible study team, also died of COVID-19. So everyone kind of knew someone who actually died of COVID as we mark its 5th anniversary. And it's also important to go to scripture as well. So the one I felt on my heart to go to was the Olivet Discourse, famous Matthew chapter 24, verses 3 and 8. It says, "Now, as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, 'Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age?' And Jesus answered and said to them, 'Take heed that no one deceives you. For many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will deceive many. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See to it that you are not troubled, for these things must come to pass. But the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. And there will be famines and pestilence and earthquakes in various places. These are all the beginning of sorrows.'"
I was asked on many an occasion in that first year of COVID, and a little bit in the second year as well, what do you think about things that are going on right now? I mean, is this the end? You know, the apocalyptic messaging that we were seeing, and the overt, you could almost look at it as mind control that was going on through propaganda pieces and messages. The nightly death updates were nothing short of dystopian. People, you know, were in fear, thinking, okay, this is apocalyptic. What's going on here? And maybe some would have been thinking, is this that plague that we see in Revelation, you know, talking about, and in the Old Testament prophets, about a third of the world? Is this what we're about to experience? When it came time to discuss various other things, I was asked, is this the mark of the beast? Is this what's going on here? And there was a degree to which I think, Simon, we have to look at this and say, all that happened fits into that framework, that formation of platform, that formation of system, the getting used to a system that can make this happen. What showed up very, very clearly, and there were people I've met who left atheism and agnosticism because of what they were seeing and the parallels to Scripture. The framework to see the beast system inaugurated and this extreme control that we read of underneath the man of lawlessness and the Antichrist, all of that we see was easily kind of, in one way you could say, practiced out.
Yeah, it wasn't only our country, was it? I mean, if you look back at the COVID-19 5 years ago, the whole world followed
Everything.
the direction of the
Everything.
World Economic Forum. So every country went into a lockdown. I mean, Israel had probably one of the worst lockdowns of any nation in the world,
Yes.
and that was primarily to protect so many Holocaust survivors. My own personal reflection of COVID-19, back in late January of 2020, I was doing our mornings with Robin Benson. I remember particularly because I had video footage of Wuhan, and we saw kind of aerial footage there of the whole city being locked down, no cars, absolutely still and silence, and thought, what on earth is this? And then thinking, that's in China. I don't think it's going to come here. China and other Asian nations suffered from bird flu. It didn't come here, so I don't think there's anything too much to worry about. And then we know that the epicenter then became northern Italy, where it spread very, very quickly and very fast. And then the beginning of March 2020 knew that it was coming here. And then when I actually visited central London for a little bit of a camera shoot with the Israel-Britain Alliance, I was in the city of London. It was like a ghost town. In the West End and in the city, hardly any people were walking on the streets. Everyone was kind of wearing face masks. It was like it was a bit like a kind of ghost town, a kind of nightmare scenario. Just walking the streets of London and hardly seeing any people. You know, this is our capital, which is usually like thousands of people on the streets, but this time it was quiet. So it had a very kind of eerie, dystopian feel to it. And then, of course, I caught COVID-19 in Christmas 2021. I was ill for well over a month, and then it triggered type 2 diabetes in me. So I know that COVID was real, but on reflection, it would very much seem that the virus was unlike any other kind of illness that I've had before, and I'm sure many of our viewers will relate to that. And you can now make sense that what actually came out of Wuhan, and it looked like it was a leak, was actual, in fact, a bioweapon.
Yeah, some of my initial thoughts on it, Simon, at the day when it was announced we were going to be entering into lockdown, I could not really believe that this is what was going on. But, you know, at the same time I thought, well, but churches will stay open. We're a primary outlet of hope and help in our communities. Churches will not countenance. Maybe some will close, but churches must stay open. And I remember a couple of key moments where I realized, oh, I don't think others are with me on that. And it was an immense source of grief. It was an immense source of sadness to me, because I thought, okay, yes, what if the whole world is about to go down the drain, as some were doom mongering? What if this is going to go to this route where such massive loss of life beyond anything we've seen occurs? We have the answer to reconciliation with God, which is so much more critical. That of all times, we should be on the front lines here. And so that this is what was going on in my mind, and we resolved to do some things to do what we could. We were, at the time, we're a very small church, but we set up a food ministry and outreach as well, regular times of prayer, and sought to do what we could with what we had. And God blessed it. He did.
Amen. So let's have a look at this excellent CBN news report, looking back at the days before lockdown, and this was in January of 2020, when CBN were warning us about COVID-19 coming out of China.
China has locked down travel in Wuhan, a city of 11 million people, as well as 2 other cities. And it's canceling major celebrations of the Chinese New Year in Beijing, trying to limit spread of the virus. The disease is spreading beyond China, but so far only 1 known case in the U.S. The man arrived in Washington state a week ago and is under quarantine in a hospital near Seattle. A robot is monitoring his vitals. Now health officials are screening passengers at 5 U.S. airports. Cases also have been reported in Thailand, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. The coronavirus is a respiratory illness, part of a family of viruses ranging from the common cold to the more deadly SARS that killed 800 people in 2002 and 2003. On CBN News Watch, CBN News health reporter Lori Johnson said officials are concerned about possible virus mutation.
Like all viruses, George, this one has the potential to mutate, to change, and when that happens, sometimes it can spread even faster and become more serious.
But the good news, officials say the virus is not an airborne disease. It is only spread through close contact with those infected by the virus. And for now, President Trump says there's no need to panic.
We think it's going to be handled very well. We've already handled it very well. CDC has been terrific, very great professionals, and we're in very good shape. And I think China's in very good shape also.
The World Health Organization meeting Wednesday said it needs more information before declaring a global health emergency. Gary Lane, CBN News.
Well, it's quite something to look back and remind ourselves as to what was being reported initially then and that particular time frame. On the 16th of March of 2020, our then Prime Minister Boris Johnson gave a televised address to the nation and imposed the first COVID-19 restrictions on the nation. The BBC Online reported the Prime Minister TV address to the nation under this headline, "Coronavirus, PM says everyone should avoid office, pubs and traveling." The PM has said everyone in the UK should avoid non-essential travel and contact with others to curb coronavirus, as the country's death toll hit 55. Boris Johnson said people should work from home where possible as part of a range of stringent new measures. Pregnant women, people over the age of 70, and those with certain health conditions should consider the advice particularly important, he said. People in at-risk groups will be asked within days to stay home for 12 weeks. More than 1,500 people have tested positive for the virus in the UK, but the actual number of cases is estimated to be between 35,000 and 50,000. And of course, Simon, at that point, we then had this range of restrictions that were put, avoiding gatherings, crowded places, pubs, clubs, and theaters. They didn't actually close pubs, clubs, and theaters right away. They was just told you should avoid them. So, you should go to work, but no one's going to be there to patronize your place, and you're not going to be having any income to pay the bills.
Yeah, because there was a big debate as well regarding the Grand National being open that actually became a big spreader. So there was lots of concerns that Boris Johnson didn't actually shut down the nation fast enough.
Well, here's a special reminder of what came out of 10 Downing Street on that day.
Good evening. The coronavirus is the biggest threat this country has faced for decades, and this country is not alone. All over the world, we're seeing the devastating impact of this invisible killer. And so tonight, I want to update you on the latest steps we're taking to fight the disease and what you can do to help. And I want to begin by reminding you why the UK has been taking the approach that we have. Without a huge national effort to halt the growth of this virus, there will come a moment when no health service in the world could possibly cope, because there won't be enough ventilators, enough intensive care beds, enough doctors and nurses. And as we've seen elsewhere in other countries that also have fantastic healthcare systems, that is the moment of real danger. To put it simply, if too many people become seriously unwell at one time, the NHS will be unable to handle it, meaning more people are likely to die, not just from coronavirus, but from other illnesses as well. So it's vital to slow the spread of the disease, because that is the way we reduce the number of people needing hospital treatment at any one time, so we can protect the NHS's ability to cope and save more lives. And that's why we've been asking people to stay at home during this pandemic. And though huge numbers are complying, and I thank you all, the time has now come for us all to do more. From this evening, I must give the British people a very simple instruction. You must stay at home. Because the critical thing we must do to stop the disease spreading between households. That is why people will only be allowed to leave their home for the following very limited purposes. Shopping for basic necessities as infrequently as possible. One form of exercise a day, for example, a run, walk or cycle, alone or with members of your household. Any medical need to provide care or to help a vulnerable person, and travelling to and from work, but only where this is absolutely necessary and cannot be done from home. That's all. These are the only reasons you should leave your home. You should not be meeting friends. If your friends ask you to meet, you should say no. You should not be meeting family members who do not live in your home. You should not be going shopping except for essentials like food and medicine. And you should do this as little as you can. And use food delivery services where you can. If you don't follow the rules, the police will have the powers to enforce them, including through fines and dispersing gatherings. To ensure compliance with the government's instruction to stay at home, we will immediately close all shops selling non-essential goods, including clothing and electronic stores, and other premises, including libraries, playgrounds and outdoor gyms and places of worship. We'll stop all gatherings of more than 2 people in public, excluding people you live with, and we'll stop all social events, including weddings, baptisms and other ceremonies, but excluding funerals.
And joining us on this week's Behind the Headlines to mark the 5th anniversary of the COVID pandemic, we're joined by Tim Dieppe from Christian Concern. Tim, it's great that you can join us today on Behind the Headlines.
Thank you. Great. Always good to be with you, Simon. Good.
And Tim, as we are marking the 5th anniversary since that dystopian nightmare that we all had to endure over the past 5 years, known as the COVID-19 pandemic, share with us where you were when the government, particularly Boris Johnson, announced that we're all going to be locked down, social distancing, we had to wear face masks. Just remind us your initial thoughts on the government's announcement they were going to take away our civil liberties.
Well, it was, I think everyone found it shocking, disturbing, frightening, alarming, stressful, anxious, thinking about how on earth are we going to cope? How is it going to work? What's going to happen with my work? What's going to happen with my children? What's going to happen with my family? What's going to happen if one of us catches it? It was very, very alarmist and very, very scary time. I was rated a vulnerable person. I was phoned up by the NHS and told, don't even bring the bins in case you catch it by doing that kind of thing. Terrifying kind of, we were, I think everyone was initially very, very scared, which was obviously the intention of the government to do that. And, very, very scared. What is this virus? How deadly is it? What could happen? Is it really going to kill us all? How many people are going to die? Am I going to die? Is my friend going to die? Is my relatives going to die? This is, I think, how we all felt at the very start of the pandemic, Simon.
Tim, we went from this very alarmist sort of attitude toward announcing the lockdown. We were told we have 3 weeks to flatten the curve. And that 3 weeks morphed into a very sustained period of time. And really, it was a year and a half before things began to return to some essence of normality, but really it is a good couple of years before we began to even see things like furlough and whatnot pulled back. How did the situation devolve so quickly?
I couldn't believe really they'd done it. I just thought, gosh, if they're doing this such a draconian thing, they must only do it for a few weeks because it's going to be so damaging to the economy, to health, to justice, to everybody's mental health and so on. I just kind of thought this is obviously an emergency measure and it must only last for weeks. You can't possibly keep it going. And of course, I was wrong because they kept it going on and on and on and on. and changing the rules, and that the law changed about what you can do, what you can't do from seemingly one day to the next at one certain stage. And of course, the big thing was they said some things are essential, and therefore they're allowed to continue business, which includes supermarkets, but also off licenses and bicycle repair shops. And some things are not essential, it's pretty much everything else, including churches, and gathering to worship and gathering to pray, which was made illegal for the first time in this country for hundreds of years. And of course, churches could provide a food bank, but if you held a prayer meeting about the food bank, that would be illegal to do that. So it's kind of extraordinary sort of disregard of the necessity of spiritual worship and the right of people to gather to worship the true and living God, as people have done throughout plagues and previous pandemics and epidemics like cholera and typhoid and so on. And we at Christian Concern thought, no, this is wrong. We have to object to this. And so we as quick as we could, we got a legal case up against the government saying this is a breach of our human rights. You can't say you can't say we're allowed to do a food bank and we're not allowed to worship God. That's crazy. And so we launched a legal case against the government, and several times just before it was about to go to court, the government would open up again and say, okay, church, you can gather for worship again now and then. But the Scottish government were more draconian even than the Westminster government, and kept churches closed for longer, which meant it did go to court there. And finally, we actually won the case there as a breach of both human rights and the Constitution in Scotland, which would apply as well in Britain. And so it was an illegal move by the government to ban Christian worship in this country, as they did in that time of COVID lockdown.
And Tim, we all appreciate the great work done by you and the team at Christian Concern during that time of lockdowns and COVID-19 restrictions, particularly in campaigning for churches to actually be open. I know that you won that historic case up in Scotland where you used kind of ancient British laws in order to do it. But share with us the impact that COVID-19 had on churches and even on street pastors who were not allowed to preach, despite the fact that probably no one around them, and there certainly there was that social distancing in place, and yet we really did see during that time state overreach over our personal lives and our civil liberties.
Oh yeah, we absolutely did. I mean, there was a church in Wales where riot police turned up, with vans of police saying, this is terrible. How can you, threatening them, and it's like living in a police state. I mean, we basically were living in a police state in that time, and street preachers, like you say, got arrested, even though they're saying this is my job, this is what I do for a living, and I think we got them cleared in every case of any offence. But the police thought that it was terribly wrong for you to possibly go outside and preach the gospel anywhere, and churches really suffered from it. There's several cases where police turned up at churches and attempted to arrest people and intimidate people and all of that that went on. Of course, also, everyone suffered spiritually from not meeting and having fellowship and gathering together and worshipping together and praying together and all of that kind of thing. I mean, we now know that lockdown overall was more damaging than coronavirus itself. And I really hope the government learns a lesson from that and decides never to do this ever again. But, it's massively costly on the nation and cost more lives than actually COVID did itself, it seems, from the studies that I've seen. And it was extremely expensive and still suffering. It's still reaping the consequences now in terms of mental health of children, in particular, backlogs in the courts and in the NHS and all of that kind of thing as well. 5 years later, the repercussions are still living with us, so we're still coping with them, still trying to work out how to get over them. So it was a very, very damaging thing indeed that the government did starting 5 years ago, and I really hope it never happens again, and that our legal case is one of the reasons why it will never happen again.
Tim, do you believe that there was in some way an abdication of responsibility on the part particularly of spiritual leaders, on the part particularly of Christian pastors in the land to say, look, this is a time of distress, this is a time of concern. Yes, there's a lot of unknowns, but the spiritual health of this nation must be of primary importance. We must not close our buildings. We must not close for worship and for prayer. We must allow this to go on. So many closed. You mentioned there was pressure on those who didn't, who persisted in some act or another, but across the board, would you say there's a degree of abdication of responsibility?
I would say that the top leaders, which of course include like the Archbishop of Canterbury, and various other bishops and evangelical leaders as well, were brought into government meetings and towed the government line, and in fact, brought the gospel into disrepute by basically repeating a gospel of cleanliness, keep your distance and wash your hands and all this kind of thing. That's more important than gathering to worship. That was the message we got from the Church of England, who even banned their own priests from going into their own churches alone to pray at no risk to themselves whatsoever. Extraordinary thing to do. But you had evangelical church leaders and leaders of organizations as well pandering to the gospel of cleanliness and the gospel of hygiene and all of that going on there. And I think there was a real lesson, abdication is perhaps the right word, but a failure of spiritual leadership across the nation to say, no, some things are more important. I mean, I wrote a couple of articles, Reagan. One was lessons from church history on coronavirus about, for example, the plague. And when the plague was here in London, it was the Anglican church leaders who were kind of conformist and liberal who ran up to the countryside as soon as possible, and the non-conformists who came in and took their place and preached the gospel at great risk to themselves, to their personal health, and went and visited people and gave people food and drink and so on, and alleviated suffering and prayed for people. And that won great respect, massive respect for the non-conformist churches, eventually enabling them to have legal recognition in the country as a result of their bravery and their obvious spiritual care and concern self-sacrificially for the saints. And I wrote another article about lessons from Spurgeon on coronavirus, and Spurgeon lived through a cholera epidemic, which I think killed something like 1 in 12 people in certain parts of London. And he didn't shy away from preaching about God's judgment on the nation and God's judgment on the city, and how we should, when these things happen, as it said in Amos, God doesn't do anything without consulting his prophets, and that these things are a form of judgment, and that yes, do reasonable cleanliness, yes, take the reasonable precautions, but don't sort of say, oh, I can't worship and I shouldn't worship, and I can't go and help this person, I can't go and offer sympathy and prayer and fellowship to people who need it, who are suffering in certain places.
And Tim, finally, can you just share with us your thoughts as more and more evidence is emerging that COVID-19 was caused by that leak in the Wuhan lab in China, and how China bears responsibility for bringing darkness upon the world, and they still haven't come to admit their role in the way that they played in the COVID global pandemic?
Well, I think, it's amazing how that was viewed as a conspiracy theory, wasn't it? That it was a Chinese virus manufactured by China or leaked by China in that Wuhan lab, even though everyone knew it came from that area and looked suspiciously like it. And that's gone from conspiracy theory to mainstream now, and major reports are now coming out saying this is what the evidence is, and it's very, very strong, and people deliberately covered it up and stopped it from being talked about and silenced it as conspiracy theory. And I hope we learn from that we need to assess evidence for ourselves and listen to what people are saying and weigh things up carefully. And I hope China is ultimately held to account for it. China obviously doesn't want to admit it, probably because they'll recognise that people want to hold them to account. But I hope they are held to account, and I hope they decide never to do something like this again, and take more precautions and all of that. But it's very concerning that it came from China and may have even been a deliberate leak from the Chinese lab there as a designed virus to particularly target human beings.
Tim, we just want to thank you so much for joining us on Behind Headlines today. Thank you for all the work you do at Christian Concern in defending our freedoms in this country. And it's been a pleasure to speak to you tonight.
Thanks very much. Always a pleasure, Simon. Thank you.
Well, many thanks to Tim Dieppe and, of course, Christian Concern for their stalwart support of freedoms in that season. It's important to look at the timeline of COVID-19 restrictions announced between 2020 and 2021. 19th of March, the Prime Minister says that the UK can turn the tide of coronavirus in 12 weeks. On the 23rd of March, he announced the first lockdown in the UK, ordering people to stay at home. The 26th of March saw lockdown measures legally come into force. The 10th of May, so initially, I remind us that there was initially 3 weeks. We were given 3 weeks to flatten the curve. This is what we were told. It would last for 3 weeks, submit to that, and then you're okay, we'll be returning. Well, actually a couple of months later, we now see on the 10th of May that Prime Minister announces a conditional plan for lifting lockdown and says that people who cannot work from home should return to the workplace but avoid public transport. How are you going to go about doing that if you depend on public transport? UK's first local lockdown came into force in Leicester and parts of Leicestershire, with more restrictions eased in England, including reopening of pubs, restaurants and hairdressers. The 18th of July saw local authorities in England gain additional powers to enforce social distancing. And then we had from the 14th of September the so-called Rule of Six. Indoor and outdoor social gatherings above 6 were banned once again in England after that momentary month of freedom. The 22nd of September, the Prime Minister then announced new restrictions in England, including a return to working from home and 10 p.m. curfew for the hospitality sector. The 30th of September, the Prime Minister said the UK was at a critical moment in the crisis and would not hesitate to impose further restrictions if needed. And the 5th of November, the second national lockdown comes into force in England, and what occurred there, we were told if we locked down for November, then we would be able to spend Christmas with our families. But on the 24th of November, the Prime Minister announced up to 3 households would be able to meet up during a 5-day Christmas period of 23 to 27th of December before that was scrapped on the 19th of December of 2020. With Boris Johnson cancelling Christmas is how it was put, and ordered millions of Brits to stay at home. Though I dare say I know of quite a few who by that point said, if this is our last Christmas, we're going to spend it together.
Absolutely. So then going into 2021, on the 4th of January, the PM says that children should return to school after the Christmas break, but warns restrictions in England will get tougher. And on the 6th of January, England enters its 3rd national lockdown. We see that Daniel Hammond, who is the former Conservative Member of Parliament, wrote on the Telegraph on Saturday, which was Saturday the 8th of March, under this heading. Never forget that making Britain into a broke, repressive dystopia was a deliberate choice. He says, what the hell were they thinking? 5 years ago, we were siding towards the most expensive mistake ever made in British history. A mistake that would lead to our financial ruin, the annihilation of our basic freedoms, and the obliteration of public trust. It says, never before had our civil liberties been so blatantly disregarded. We were subject to house arrest on the basis of unsupported censure. Our property rights were violated, our freedom of expression repressed, even our ability to leave the country denied. Where were all the human rights lawyers when they were needed? Where were the doughty street types so vocal in their defence of illegal immigrants, convicts and terrorists? The one time that there truly was a national human rights violation, they were cheering it on.
Well, this is the tragic reality, as he goes on to say that the British state then told lie after lie. Just 3 weeks. Face masks are dangerous. I remember that. Anyone who was wearing a face mask was basically ostracized at first. Oh, and then one more month. Hang in there, Simon. One more month. Face masks are essential. You know, I was walking down the street where you could walk without a face mask, and was without a face mask, and this individual spat in my direction how selfish I was. another individual on a bus before any of the face masks were being imposed. He, I think, mistook me as being Italian, and I was wearing a T-shirt for the football club Roma, and he started swearing at me. And just, so I thought...
Probably because he thought you're a Roma fan.
Yeah, well, maybe, yeah. But it was, I leaned over and said, sorry, is there something I've done? And I got another earful, so I just thought I'd desist from this point. But bizarre behavior that we were seeing. Squash the sombrero, we were told. Young people are at risk, just 2 more weeks. Wait for the vaccine. Wait for the second vaccine. Your jab will protect others. We were then told you had to get the jab in some sectors, or you would be sacked. I knew people who left their job because they thought they would be sacked. I knew people who lost their job because they weren't going to take the vaccine. It's the third shot that really works. You need the booster. There's this dangerous new variant. One last lockdown, just 3 more weeks. All of this, as we approach the 5th anniversary, Hannon goes on to say, we don't like to admit that we destroyed our economy, took away part of our kids' childhoods, permanently aggrandized the state, and indebted ourselves for a generation, all for nothing. That is, those who consented and conformed. Of course, many did not.
And he also makes a very good point that on March the 16th, Neil Ferguson and the team at the Imperial College published an apocalyptic report based on the modelling that estimated that if no measures were put in place, then deaths over the following 2 years could reach more than 500,000. So why was Ferguson taken seriously? A quick Google search would have revealed that he had a history of making ridiculous alarmist claims, including over BSE and swine flu. His study, far from being cutting-edge simulation, was a rehash model of one he published in 2006 using rough and ready estimates, where he said that home quarantine would mean a 75% reduction in contacts with a 50% compliance rate, and how social distancing would mean 75% reduction in outside contacts, offset by 25% increased in home contacts, and so on.
Now, Hannon goes on to say that the grisly truth is we wanted to believe Ferguson, although we sometimes now imagine that Boris wrenched our freedoms from our unwilling hands. It was the other way round. We've forgotten the Go Home COVIDiots banners, the terrified phone-ins, the YouGov poll showing 93% of voters wanted a lockdown. This is the reality. People, I knew people, Simon, I knew pastors who one individual, very concerning conversation where encountered in a public space, speaking of how I was going to go away to Europe to see some family, and was hoping that the travel tier system would change and that it would force he and his family to quarantine for another 2 weeks, because that would mean more time off. And for those of us who were literally slaving away day and night to seek to care for our communities, that was something that was very, very jarring to hear, that here's a spiritual leader who wants lockdown, who likes it this way, because there's not as much responsibility is how they took it. While for many, it was only an increase of responsibility.
Absolutely. So we've got to look at how COVID-19 impacted upon Christian freedoms in this country. So Christian Concern in the COVID-19 pandemic launched a series of legal court cases to protect Christian freedoms. They said following the government's restrictive lockdown measures to try to combat the spread of COVID-19, the Joint Committee on Human Rights launched a call for evidence on the impacts of local and national lockdowns. The impact of lockdown on the freedom of religion and belief, and in particular on the collective worship, have interferences with the freedom of religion, and the belief has been proportionate. They go on and say that responses raised concerns that previous lockdowns in England and Wales were not proportionate. It says, we argued that they violate the UK's obligations under the ECHR by imposing criminal sanctions on churches, their congregations, and other people of faith. and that the interference particularly affects the rights to manifest their beliefs in communal worship, teaching, practice and observance. And of course we found that yours truly, Reagan King, made the news in November the 20th, 2020. So the Daily Mail reported back on the 15th of November 2020 under the headline, "Police officers stop evangelical church from holding baptism service attended by 30 worshippers for breaching lockdown restrictions." Says worshippers gathered at the Angel Church in Clerkenwell, London on Sunday. Lead pastor Reagan King, 28, said he wanted to hold baptisms for the greater good.
Well, there's something wrong with the headline there. It said that they stopped the baptism from happening. We did actually have the baptism, so there we
It's
go.
reported by the Daily Mail there.
Yes, yeah, they wouldn't have known. We waited till they swanned off. But police officers sought to stop, yes, but you know, when asked about that time, and at that time and in the course of the week that followed, why we believe this was important and necessary, we believed that, again, and I maintain to this day, the spiritual health of the nation is of even greater importance than the physical. We had people in supermarkets at self-checkouts, you know, touching the screens and everything, and they weren't being cleaned afterwards.
Yeah, and garden centres.
I made the point. I made the point to our local press. I said, "You're safer coming to church than you are going into the supermarket."
And there was an outdoor baptism, and at the time they were allowing people to visit garden centres.
It was indoor.
I just want to give one of the quotes here. So this one, asked why he had decided to breach the restrictions, Mr. King said, "Because I believe that we serve a greater good. We have a greater good than whatever this is." Referring to the police presence, he said, "This is not something I ever wanted. This is an essential service that we provide. It's about loving our neighbour, and you can talk with a number of people here who are extremely vulnerable, homeless, and on the verge of being very, very isolated." But also we need to look at this excellent new report that's been published by The Sun, a newspaper, under the headline, "The Great COVID Cover-Up." This was the Chernobyl of biology. A Sun documentary exposes Wuhan leak behind the US and US shock role in it. Says few of us had heard of the Chinese city of Wuhan when the world first was paralyzed by COVID-19 5 years ago. Today, the sprawling metropolis is known to be the pandemic that claimed over 227,000 lives in the UK, along with its sinister labs. Top secret biological experiments are carried out.
Within the first few days of Britain's initial lockdown in March of 2020, as millions were confined to their homes, questions were already being asked about whether Wuhan's Institute of Virology could be behind the outbreak. Now, as the country marks the 5-year anniversary of COVID-19, an exclusive documentary by The Sun reveals the experts, scientists and investigators who not only believed the virus was caused by a lab leak, but that American scientists helped to cover up the scandal. Our documentary took me to the heart of the origins of COVID and explores whether China was trying to cover up the creation of a biological weapon by blaming the pandemic on a wet food market 17 miles away. We also reveal that while scientists publicly insisted the disease came from natural sources, behind the scenes they were exchanging messages about a laboratory leak. One expert told us Watergate was nothing compared to this. This is the Chernobyl of biology. Dr. Robert Redfield, the former head of the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, said that a few months before the pandemic, the Wuhan Institute was taken over by the Chinese military, while officials deleted its databases and took on a contract for a new ventilation system. We now know that 3 lab researchers fell ill in November of 2019, a month before the first COVID cases were reported to the World Health Organization.
So let's have a look now at this CBN report that looks into this serious report that China is responsible for the COVID-19 pandemic with the leak that occurred in the laboratory known as Wuhan.
The former director of national intelligence told a House committee Tuesday that a leak of COVID-19 from a laboratory in Wuhan, China, is the only credible explanation for the pandemic that killed millions of people worldwide.
My informed assessment, as a person with as much access as anyone to our government's intelligence during the initial year of the pandemic, has been and continues to be that a lab leak is the only explanation credibly supported by our intelligence, by science, and by common sense.
John Ratcliffe also accused the Chinese Communist Party of orchestrating a massive cover-up of its role in the pandemic, including destroying medical tests, samples, and data, and intimidating and coercing witnesses, journalists, and global health officials. A report released Monday by Senator Roger Marshall also accused the Chinese government of a cover-up and indicated the pandemic may have started from two separate lab leaks engaged in risky gain-of-function research in the fall of 2019, months before the Chinese government alerted the World Health Organization of an outbreak.
To start with, maybe just 1 or 2 people were infected with the virus, and then later on, during the vaccine development, is when most likely this had a bigger leak.
Ratcliffe testified there's still no environmental source identified for COVID-19.
And COVID-19 was never known to exist in any animal or species before the pandemic began. Those are scientific facts that are not disputed, and there's nothing political about that.
But much of the mainstream media claim that the idea that COVID-19 originated in a Chinese lab had been debunked and was a conspiracy theory. Social media platforms labeled the lab leak theory misinformation and even censored it.
Because even considering the lab leak thesis was considered disinformation, it was also considered racist in some circles. No independent investigation really took place. The Chinese tolerated this so-called investigation under the auspices of its puppets at the World Health Organization, but that clearly wasn't an independent, credible investigation.
Republicans Tuesday also accused Dr. Anthony Fauci of trying to suppress the lab leak theory because it would bring unwanted attention to the fact the U.S. government was helping to fund the Wuhan lab's research.
Federal investigator David Asher, a former U.S. State Department official, said the probe into the origins of COVID was the biggest intelligence failure since Pearl Harbor. An astounding statement there. He compared the deadly outbreak to the Watergate scandal, which took down President Richard Nixon in the 1970s. This is the Chernobyl of biology, he said, accusing U.S. scientists of helping orchestrate an outrageous cover-up and whitewashing the lab theory. David believes that Chinese dictator Jinping engineered COVID to control the world order, spark chaos, and sow seeds of uncertainty. He points out that China had already stated at a world conference in 2011 that it was looking at creating biological weapons. He said, at the time, when I talked to people who were there, they were like, it was shocking. It was almost like China was dropping the death card, like Apocalypse Now. If you mess with us, this is what could happen to you. I don't think COVID was released as a weapon, or they would have released it, say, outside of the Pentagon. But could it have been a laboratory accident involving programs they were running with reckless abandon? Absolutely. And as a result, David is calling for a 9/11 style commission to get to the bottom of the pandemic's cause, claiming that classified intelligence on its origins would make your head explode.
I mean, it's frightening, and we do need a 9/11 commission looking into the origins of COVID-19 because it affected all of us. It affected our way of life. It affected the world. It's caused major geopolitical fault lines to emerge in the world. You only have to look at Russia, Ukraine, Israel, Gaza situation. It brought the Democrats to power, and if it wasn't for COVID-19, Donald Trump was certainly won a second term in office. It brought about a dystopian nightmare upon all of us, where we saw that our cherished freedoms were actually taken away overnight. We had state overreach, and of course Christians weren't allowed to go to church or to praise God or to worship God in church. A truly frightening time, and we have to learn the lessons of never again, and that our government needs to be more open with us about what was actually happening at the time. But spiritually, this has had a huge impact, particularly on children's development and education as well.
Yeah, and this is something that we're now seeing and hearing a great deal in relation to the children who particularly were sheltered or were kept in delayed development in varying levels, which is, there's people who have to be held to account for. None of this stuff happens in a vacuum. But what we've seen and we've talked about is the prophetic element of this, the acceleration of the building of that infrastructure of the beast system across a range of ways. We need to learn lessons. Who are we when it comes to times of trial? Will we stand firm and continue to trust in the Lord our God, or will we cave to the fears and foibles of this world? It's important that we always look to the Lord. He alone can save.